Nietzsche versus Darwin. Because of ideas like the opposition of masters and slaves, the will to power, and the immoral or amoral stance taken in books like Beyond Good and Evil, we tend to assume Friedrich Nietzsche held a sort of Darwinian worldview. This is because the word Darwinian evokes in us a sense of the indifferent state of nature, where evolution favors the most fit without regard for morality or fairness, which seems to be very closely aligned with the might makes right views expressed by Nietzsche. So you might be surprised that Nietzsche was actually very much opposed to Darwin, and he presented in his works a powerful critique of Darwin's ideas. This might seem hard to believe. After all, Darwin's ideas, like evolution, have been scientifically proven almost beyond a shadow of a doubt. Every biologist, paleontologist, and pretty much anyone who has ever seen a documentary knows that Darwin was correct. So how could Nietzsche have a substantive critique of the rigorously, scientifically tested Darwin, who on top of that seems to be closely aligned with Nietzsche's own view of the world? This is the question I'm going to try to answer in this video. Did Nietzsche misunderstand Darwin? Today, you will often hear critics and fans who have only read Nietzsche casually alike claim that he misunderstood Darwin. The critics do this in an attempt to discredit Nietzsche by painting him as stupid, antiquated, and unscientific. However, even those who like him, or at least think he had some intelligent things to say, just can't not see how negatively he talks about Darwin in his books. And because Darwin and his ideas have been sanctified in our culture, they try to say that Nietzsche was only familiar with his ideas second-hand, and if he had read Darwin directly, Nietzsche would surely agree with him. But this is incorrect. Nietzsche really did understand Darwin very well, and yet he still vehemently disagreed with him. So how is this possible? To fully understand Nietzsche's critique of Darwin, we should first talk about the Darwinian worldview. Darwinian view of the world. The Darwinian worldview is a perspective on reality through the lens of biological evolution. It originated from the 19th century English biologist Charles Darwin. A basic explanation of the Darwinian worldview is this. All living organisms, from bacteria through plants and fungi to human beings, developed through the mechanism of natural selection acting on the small variations between individual organisms, resulting in a higher ability of the most fit to compete, survive, and reproduce, and thus a greater proliferation of their characteristics in the next generation through heritability. Darwin himself put it like this: as many more individuals of each species are born than can possibly survive, and as, consequently, there is a frequently recurring struggle for existence, it follows that any being, if it vary, however slightly, in any manner profitable to itself, under the complex and sometimes varying conditions of life, will have a better chance of surviving and thus be naturally selected. From the strong principle of inheritance, any selected variety will tend to propagate its new and modified form. The phrase most associated with Darwin and the Darwinian worldview is the survival of the fittest. Interestingly, this phrase doesn't come from Darwin, but from one of his fellow Englishmen, and perhaps the best known proponent of social Darwinism, Herbert Spencer. It is not the strongest of the species that survives, not the most intelligent that survives. It is the one that is the most adaptable to change. We need to understand that if we are going to use the phrase survival of the fittest, that the word fittest means in this context not the healthiest and strongest, but instead the best able to survive and reproduce. Since Darwin published his book On the Origin of Species in the year 1859, the Darwinian worldview has become almost ubiquitous in our society and now exerts enormous influence in the fields of biology, psychology, sociology, and philosophy, but also in the mind of almost everyone. It is taught to us from a young age, and it shapes our understanding of what life is. And that is the main problem Nietzsche had with Darwin. He thought Darwin had misled us about what life actually is. Nietzsche's critique of Darwin. The core of Nietzsche's disagreement with Darwin can be found both in the phrase survival of the fittest and also in many quotes from Darwin himself. It is the emphasis on survival as the defining aspect and goal of life. Darwin often talks about the struggle for existence and survival. It is everywhere throughout his writing. Nothing is easier than to admit in words the truth of the universal struggle for life, or more difficult, at least I have found it so, than constantly to bear this conclusion in mind. Nietzsche would agree that the struggle for survival does define some forms of life, namely the lowest and weakest. I will use in this video a lot of writing from Bronze Age Pervert and borrow many ideas from him, specifically from the first part of his book, The Flame of Life. Although I will add to it other insights, and I recommend to everyone watching this video to read it for themselves. Now let's proceed with the critique. Darwin's style of thinking, the survival-centered style of thinking, wouldn't have had such an impact if it were simply false. It is actually true, but only about a certain kind of life. The mistake is to think it describes all life. They abstract from way of yeast to ways of animal and man, but this is backward. Specifically, Nietzsche said struggle defines life in the place where Darwin's mind was formed, in 19th century England, and that's why it also defines life in the Darwinian worldview. Darwin is meaningless without Malthus, but this is why Nietzsche is right about both of them when he says they describe only life in England, or more precisely, the England of that time. Since the Industrial Revolution and even well into the 20th century, the conditions in the cities of England were truly hellish, as child mortality became a thing of the past and the lowest classes swarmed the cities looking for jobs in the factories. They became overcrowded and filthy. Marx and his followers, at least, were right about that, and that's why they could prey on this condition. Because these lower classes now had many more children than they ever used to have before, and they weren't accustomed to this new reality, it led to them putting all of their effort into feeding more mouths instead of improving the lives of the children they had. And this is the world of Malthus and of Darwin. Life under filth, life under distress. A Darwinian might object to this and say that it proves Nietzsche didn't understand Darwin, because this isn't what survival of the fittest means. There is no defining aspect of life or goal in evolution. It just happens to be true that those organisms which survive pass their traits on to the next generation as a matter of accident and purposeless chance, driven by the material mechanism of natural selection. However, as Nietzsche said, man will desire nothingness rather than desire nothing at all. And in the same way, even the most devoted Darwinian, and even Darwin himself, when they aren't paying attention, will start talking about purposes and goals. It is hard to talk about life without any consideration of purpose. Animals, humans most of all, seem very much driven by motives and goals, and it is always the question of purposes and ends that are the actually interesting ones. The mechanisms of heredity, or the means by which a species is shaped, natural or unnatural selection, which is really Darwin's only insight, is the least interesting part of all. Actually, it is a tautology. Yes, only those animals who have managed to reproduce actually pass on their traits. The sleight of hand Darwin and his followers perform, often unconsciously, is that they start making the goal and purpose of life out of survival. Thus, from the war of nature, from famine and death, the most exalted object which we are capable of conceiving, namely the production of the higher animals, directly follows. There is grandeur in this view of life. Even right there, in the origin of species, Darwin just slightly reveals his tendency to make a value out of survival when he talks about the most exalted object which we are capable of conceiving and the grandeur of this view of life. Not to mention, he is wrong in what he writes. The higher animals were not produced from famine and death, but instead from abundance and prosperity. Survival and reproduction are not the goals of the higher forms of life. They are only the byproducts of the drive for prosperity, thriving, growth, and power. The noblest people have always chosen death instead of slavery, even when slavery would assure survival. Many Caribs trapped into slavery died because they couldn't endure this. Some bit through their arms to escape their chains and endured any pain to escape captivity. Germanic mothers would kill infants when Roman legions closed in. It was the same for the Comanche and the Japanese and many other noble people. For this reason, Nietzsche say noble peoples do not endure slavery. They're either free or they die out. There is no adaptation to slavery for some types of life. What is that people who has chosen survival at any price? The price they paid was monstrous, and such a people becomes monstrous and distorted if it accepts this. And it is the same for the noblest animals. When they are taken from the wild and put in captivity, they attempt to escape in any way they can, enduring the worst kinds of pain and risking their life to do so. If they are trapped, they often rather choose death. But if they can't escape, not even through death, they often refuse to breed, and you can see in their eyes a terrible sadness. Mere survival is not a worthy purpose for these forms of life. Bab talks about a waterfall around which flocks of small birds would gather, and when the wind would spray drops of water everywhere and create little rainbows, the birds would get excited, come out of the crevices in the rock, and start flying around like mad, performing acrobatics in the air and reveling in their power of flight. They do things like this even when it isn't a part of any mating ritual, even when it isn't the right season for mating. They do it even if it obviously isn't very protective, even if it increases the risk that a larger bird or another predator could catch them. And they do it even though it definitely doesn't preserve energy and calories, even though it is intensely wasteful. Another example is a group of wild horses in broad plains. The lead stallion often starts to gallop from left to right with wildness and speed, and the whole herd follows him in a rush of power and freedom. How do you explain these behaviors with survival and reproduction? No, survival and reproduction characterize only low forms of life. We can see this clearly when we contrast insects, who only live a couple days and can have 1,000 young during that time in batches of hundreds, to noble beasts, prehistoric man chief among them, who often only have a dozen young, with humans usually having a litter of one and living sometimes for more than a century. For a human to mature takes at least 15 years, and we don't reach full maturity until we are in our 20s. In that time, about 400 generations of the housefly are born and die. This is also why Darwin is wrong when he says that production of the higher animals directly follows from evolution. The housefly is far more evolved than us, but clearly it isn't the higher animal. Again, Darwin says this because it is the valuation, the goal, that is the most interesting part of life. Here we should return to the phrase survival of the fittest and explain why it is another trick performed by the Darwinian. The word fittest implies strength and health, and the Darwinian doesn't fight this perception. He often agrees with it. It is only when he is pressed on it when he starts to claim it has no relation to quality. What surprises me most when surveying the great destinies of man is always seeing before me the opposite of what Darwin and his school see, or what they want to see today. Selection in favor of the stronger, in favor of those who have come off better, the progress of the species. The very opposite is quite palpably the case. If we look at another aspect of our biology, our large and powerful brains, we must realize they require enormous amounts of energy to function. Humans are one of the most energy inefficient animals in the world because of them. They burn about a quarter of your daily calorie intake. In a human lifetime, enormous amount of energy is wasted. If our life was only about survival and procreation, surely we would be more efficient. But we and other animals similar to us in that aspect are designed to prosper, to thrive, not for mere survival. Final words. In nature, it is not distress which rules, but rather abundance. squandering even to the point of absurdity. The struggle for survival is only an exception, a temporary restriction of the will to life. Nietzsche pointed out that there are two forces in nature: the ascendant force, that is the primary driver for the behavior of the higher life forms, and an opposing force, the spirit of gravity, that aims only at survival and continued existence through procreation. The spirit of gravity drives life towards homogeneity and smallness, like in the case of yeast, because they are numerous, adaptable, and it is difficult to kill them all. Darwin's biggest mistake was to confuse one of these forces for the other.